The basilica groaned under the weight of heat and grief. Thousands had gathered beneath its vaulted ceiling, the air thick with incense that clung to the lungs and blurred the edges of vision. Candles crowded the aisles in trembling rows, their flames stretching upward like thin, desperate fingers begging for air. The choir's voices drifted through the haze, soft and haunting, too fragile to carry the mounting tension pressing down on every heart in the room. At the center of the basilica, raised above all mortal eyes, rested the coffin. Embossed in gold, guarded by scarlet-robed cardinals, draped in vestments stitched for kings, saints, and men who believed themselves beyond the reach of ordinary decay. Inside those polished wooden walls lay the Vicar of Christ, or what was left of him. From a distance, it looked immaculate, holy, untouchable. But the closer one stood, the more the illusion faltered. The silk stretched too tightly across the midsection. The air above the coffin seemed to tremble with more than just candle heat. A faint creaking sound whispered beneath the chanting, subtle at first, then unmistakable wood complaining, straining, begging for release. No one dared look directly at the source. Clergy exchanged glances meant to be unreadable, yet fear leaked through their composure. A young acolyte took one step back, then another. A bishop paused mid-ritual, his lips trembling as he pretended to continue praying. Somewhere in the shadows, behind the carved marble columns, someone whispered a warning that rippled through the crowd like a shiver down a spine. It burst, right in front of everyone. Witnesses leaned closer, as if trying to catch the truth hiding beneath the words. A rumor, yes, but it sounded too precise, too terrified, to be a mere story. The coffin throbbed again, a slow, unnatural swelling. Inside, gases shifted with the ominous groan of something trapped, something swollen, something that had been building pressure far beyond what the delicate wood could bear. The summer heat had turned this holy sanctuary into an oven. The body inside, ravaged by disease, had begun to rebel against the rituals meant to honor it. And now, every rustle of silk, every crack of wood, every flicker of candlelight felt like a warning. A warning that the Pope lying within was no longer simply dead. He was volatile. He was dangerous. He was moments away from turning one of the holiest funerals in history into a spectacle of horror the Church would spend centuries trying to bury. And all anyone could do was wait, breath held, prayers faltering, eyes locked on the coffin, as the pressure inside that sacred box climbed toward the moment no one was prepared to witness. Before we descend deeper into this unraveling nightmare, before we peel back the layers of heat, infection, and ritual that turned a pontiff's final rest into a moment of rupture, pause for a breath. Stories like this are not merely told, they are recovered, unearthed from the silence where history tried to hide them. If you wish to follow these buried truths, these forgotten tragedies that echo through ages long after the candles have burned out, then let your presence be known. Lend your voice. Lend your curiosity. Lend your attention to the stories the world tried to erase. And if the shadows of the past call to you as they do to us, then join us by tapping like, subscribing to Echoes of Time, and letting us know where in the world you are listening from. Now, let us return to the basilica, to the coffin, to the swelling silence, just before history itself convulsed. He had once been a figure carved out of certainty, a man whose slightest gesture could sway kingdoms, whose signature could redraw borders, whose voice could silence arguments simply by the weight of the throne behind it. People knelt when he entered a room. Princes bowed, even kings lowered their eyes. But power does not protect the flesh, and in the final weeks of his life, those who served him began to notice the first betrayals, quiet ones, almost polite in how they announced themselves. A stiffness in his walk, a tremor in his hand when he lifted the chalice, a faint, sour scent that clung to him after long hours of exhaustion. Harmless things, they told themselves. The toll of age, the strain of rule. Yet the changes deepened. His skin grew mottled, tinged with a darkness that seemed to bloom beneath the surface. Servants who had once fought for the honor of attending him now hesitated at the doorway, their eyes watering at the smell that followed him like an unwelcome prophecy. He tried to pray through the pain. He tried to hide the decay. He tried to sit straighter, breathe slower, pretend he wasn't dissolving from the inside out. But rot is a truth that cannot be disguised. Some nights, the palace walls themselves seemed to listen. From behind heavy wooden doors came low groans, pain twisting a man who had once commanded the world. Aides whispered that he barely slept, that the infection gnawed at him with a hunger that no saint's relic could soothe. Those closest to him knew the truth long before the city learned of his decline. His flesh was beginning to die before he did. Physicians arrived in hurried procession, their faces pale beneath their hoods, carrying jars of oils, bundles of herbs, vials of remedies that had saved lesser men. They pressed fingers against the swollen skin along his limbs, listening for the crackle beneath tiny pockets of trapped air, shifting like creatures beneath the soil. They exchanged glances. They hoped the Pope would not see. But he did. He always saw. In his final days, he ordered the windows open despite the cold nights, begging for air that no longer reached him. He asked for candles to be dimmed, for mirrors to be covered, for priests to stay close, even when the odor made them wince behind their sleeves. He felt himself slipping, inch by inch, swallowed by something he could not command. The city outside continued its rhythms, market stalls opening at dawn, bells tolling across the rooftops, pilgrims wandering the narrow streets, unaware that their spiritual father was fighting a losing battle inside a gilded prison of silk and stone. And as he weakened, those around him began preparing for the moment they dreaded more than they admitted. They would soon have to present this decaying body to the world, and if death did not grant him dignity, then ritual would have to force it. Even if the body resisted, even if the flesh continued to betray them, even if the rot had already taken more than they could hide, death did not come gently. It crept through him in ways that defied the understanding of every healer who knelt at his bedside. They searched for fevers, for wounds, for signs of curses whispered by jealous rivals. But what they found was far more terrifying, something that behaved as if it had a will of its own. It began as a shadow beneath the skin, a darkening along the legs, then the arms, then the torso, creeping like spilled ink soaking through parchment. Touch it, and the flesh yielded too quickly. Press it, and a brittle crackle answered back, like the faint breaking of dried twigs underfoot. His attendants struggled to hide their fear. When they bathed him, his skin sloughed away in thin sheets, drifting into the basin like wilted petals from a dying flower. When they dressed him, they worked in silence, their hands trembling as they maneuvered limbs that no longer behaved like limbs, but sacks filled with something shifting, something swollen, something unstable. The smell announced itself before the man did. A heavy, sweet, clinging odor that coiled around the tapestries and seeped into the stone. Priests placed bowls of herbs in every corner, desperate to mask the scent. Servants lit thuribles at all hours, filling the chambers with smoke until even breathing became labor. But nothing could overcome the rot. Witnesses later whispered that it felt as though his body had begun to lose the boundary between life and death. That the disease, whatever name the era might have given it, was devouring him faster than prayer, faster than ritual, faster than the very hours marked by the cathedral bells. Some called it divine punishment, others demonic affliction. A few, in moments of shaken honesty, admitted it looked like nature reclaiming what no human rank could preserve. Beneath his robes, his body ballooned, swollen by forces no one understood. Gas moved under the skin with a sickening glide, as though invisible hands were kneading him from the inside. Each shift produced a low murmur beneath the flesh, a sound too unnatural to mistake for breath. Still he lived, suspended between agony and fevered delirium. He begged for cool air, but the room remained thick and suffocating. He begged for silence, but the crackle beneath his skin followed him no matter how still he lay. He begged for mercy, but the disease offered none. And when the end finally came, it was not peaceful. Those present said his last breaths were wet, strained, choked by fluids that should not have been in his lungs. His eyes, once fierce with command, stared upward, as if trying to focus on a world already slipping beyond reach. Then stillness, a stillness that should have brought relief. But the attendants who stepped forward knew instantly this was not the stillness that precedes peace. This was the stillness of a storm gathering in secret. A storm sealed inside a failing body. A storm that would not remain quiet for long. The moment the final breath left his body, the attendants moved quickly, not out of disrespect, but out of fear. For in that heat-soaked chamber, death was not the end. It was a beginning. The beginning of a race against time they were destined to lose. They approached him with cloths soaked in wine, with oils meant to purify, with the instruments their fathers and grandfathers had used on the popes before him. Ritual demanded dignity. Tradition demanded ceremony. The Church demanded a body that could be displayed before all of Christendom. But when their hands touched him, they recoiled. His flesh had already begun to surrender. It slid beneath their fingers, soft and unstable, yielding like fruit left to rot in the sun. When they lifted his arm, the skin shifted, then tore. When they tried to turn him, gases trapped in his torso stirred with a low, bubbling groan. One attendant refused to continue. Another crossed himself so many times, his fingers shook in a frantic blur. Yet the work had to be done. They washed him as gently as they could, but no amount of care prevented the darkened skin from peeling away, revealing the glistening decay beneath. What should have been a solemn cleansing felt instead like dismantling a body already collapsing into itself. They attempted to remove the organs the standard ritual meant to slow decay, but the moment the incision was made, a wave of stench erupted so violently that one attendant fainted, striking the floor before he could even cry out. Another dropped his tools and ran for the window, gulping air between dry heaves. Inside the open torso, the organs had liquefied into a thick, dark slurry. It oozed from the cut like a grotesque, offering the body could not hold. They worked quickly, desperately scooping what they could, whispering prayers not meant for ceremony, but for endurance. Then came the stuffing. They packed the cavity with herbs, salt, resins, anything that might slow the ruin, but each handful pushed the swollen flesh outward, stretching it like an overfilled wineskin. The torso bulged unnaturally, struggling against the bindings even before they tied the final knots. What they created was not preservation, it was containment. A fragile barrier over a body fighting to burst free. Finally, they dressed him in vestments, layers of brocade, linen, and silk, meant to disguise the collapse beneath. They coated his face in wax to mimic serenity, smoothing the mask over features already distorted by swelling. The result looked peaceful from a distance, holy even, but up close, the deception cracked. The skin beneath the wax shifted. The abdomen pulsed with pressure. The wrapping strained at the seams as though the corpse were breathing with borrowed air. They stepped back, horrified by what they had created. A body no longer merely dead, a body sealed, tightened, and forced into regalia it could not contain. A body swelling in the suffocating Roman heat, gathering pressure like a storm trapped beneath silk. And tomorrow they would carry it into the basilica, into the crowds, into the candles, into the sweltering heat that waited to ignite everything they had failed to stop. They carried him into the basilica at dawn, when the air was still cool enough to breathe without effort. But even then, the attendants moving the litter could feel the weight shifting unnaturally fluid inside the body, sloshing with each step, gases murmuring beneath the silk like distant thunder. The cathedral doors opened, and the city stepped forward to mourn its shepherd. The basilica had been prepared with all the splendor expected of a papal passing. Golden draperies hung from towering pillars. Hundreds of candles bathed the chamber in a trembling amber glow. Clouds of incense drifted like ghostly veils caught in the rafters. and at the center, elevated above the sea of mourners, the catafalque awaited, an ornate platform of carved wood and embroidered cloth, a throne for the dead, a stage on which no one suspected disaster was already unfolding. They laid his body upon it with ceremonial precision, but the moment they stepped back, something was wrong. A faint sag formed in the draped fabric where the abdomen rested. An oozing stain, dark, slow, almost invisible, began spreading beneath the vestments, and the air, already heavy with incense, shifted. It carried something else now, a sweetness that did not belong to spice or oil, a warmth that clung to the throat, a scent that, once noticed, could not be ignored. The first pilgrims approached the bier. Some knelt, some crossed themselves, some whispered prayers for the soul of the man who had guided their faith. But as they drew near, many faltered. Eyes watered, hands trembled. Several stepped back with sudden urgency, covering their faces, pretending it was the incense overwhelming them. A mother pulled her child close and hurried away. A monk staggered to the nearest column and retched quietly into the shadows. The guards posted around the bier exchanged subtle glances, each silently begging for a shorter shift. Still, the ceremony continued. Hour after hour, as dignitaries arrived from distant lands, the basilica swelled with bodies, heat, and suffocating expectation. The sun climbed, pouring through stained glass windows until the nave became an oven of trapped light. The corpse responded. Wax along the cheeks began to crack, splitting like dried earth under summer drought. Tiny fissures widened, revealing discolored flesh beneath. The hands, folded so carefully over the chest, swelled against their jeweled gloves until the seams strained. And beneath the vestments, the abdomen rose higher, then fell, then rose again. As if the dead pope were drawing breath he no longer possessed. Some claimed to hear sounds wet, shifting murmurs, soft pops, subtle crackles like a bladder stretched to its limit. Others noticed droplets gathering at the edges of the wrappings, sliding down to stain the cloth in thin, dark trails. The embalmers hovered nearby, summoned again and again to adjust, tighten, conceal. But nothing they did slowed the inevitable. Their hands shook with every touch, every inspection, every attempt to disguise what was happening beneath the silk. By nightfall, fear had settled over the clergy like dust. A whispered warning passed among them. He is swelling again. And though no one dared say it aloud, every pair of eyes drawn to the bulging torso, every nose catching the creeping odor, every ear straining to identify the unnatural sounds beneath the vestments, arrived at the same silent conclusion. The body was failing its containment. The heat was feeding whatever stirred inside him. The swell was growing. And if it continued, if the pressure rose any higher, the disaster the attendants feared most might occur not in secret, but before an entire grieving city. By the second night, the basilica no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a chamber holding its breath. The candles had burned low, their once steady flames trembling wildly in the thick heat. The incense that once masked the truth had grown heavy, cloying, unable to conquer the darker scent seeping relentlessly from the bier. Those tasked with tending the body hovered near the walls now, avoiding the platform entirely unless ordered otherwise. And in the shadows behind the altar, the arguments began. At first, they were only whispers. A bishop leaning close to a cardinal, voice thin with urgency. "We cannot leave him here another day." A younger priest, pale and shaking, murmuring to anyone who would listen. The people notice, even the pilgrims smell it. An older cleric pressing a trembling hand to his forehead. "The swelling is worse. You saw it. You all saw it." But standing at the center of them was the master of ceremonies, a man whose entire life had been built on preserving the dignity of papal ritual. He refused to bend. "This funeral must follow tradition to its end," he said, his voice firm but fraying at the edges. "The world is watching. A rushed burial would invite rumors far more dangerous than this." He did not finish the sentence. No one needed him to. Another cardinal stepped forward, lowering his voice to a near whisper, as if even the walls might overhear. "If we delay, there may be nothing left to bury." His words fell like a stone in water quiet, but sending ripples through every man in the room. They debated in circles, one side pleading for mercy, for urgency, for swift burial in the cool shade of the catacombs below. They spoke of safety, of dignity, of the very real danger building beneath the vestments. Their eyes darted often toward the bier, as though expecting it to tremble at any moment. The other side invoked tradition, ceremony, the ancient requirement that a pope lie in state for days, so the entire city could pay its respects. And beneath their arguments lay the fear none dared voice. If they shortened the funeral, if they altered the ritual even slightly, the faithful would ask why. And how could they answer? How could they explain that the body of the Holy Father had become a fragile vessel of gases and decay? That heat and disease had transformed him into something unstable? That the slightest pressure, the smallest shift, the wrong moment might unleash a spectacle too grotesque for any sacred place? Their silence trapped them, bound by fear, bound by ritual, bound by the unbearable knowledge that each hour brought them closer to disaster. Finally, the decision was made reluctantly, quietly, with no man willing to claim responsibility for it. The funeral would continue. The body would remain on display. The night vigil would proceed as planned. But as they emerged from their secret chamber back into the basilica's oppressive heat, each carried a private dread. Each heard, in the quiet of the vast chamber, the faintest crackle beneath the layers of silk. Each caught the sour, rising odor drifting on the currents of candle-warmed air. They had chosen tradition over caution, ceremony over safety, appearance over truth, and deep within the coffin's silk-wrapped confines, the pressure continued to mount. Silent, unstoppable, deadly, dawn broke on the day of the funeral with a sky the color of tarnished brass, heavy, oppressive, as though even the heavens hesitated to witness what was about to unfold. By the time the basilica doors opened, a river of mourners had already formed, flowing through the city streets in somber silence. Inside, the heat was unbearable. Every candle burned with a warped, wavering flame. Incense pooled low to the ground like fog trapped in a valley. The choir hummed its ancient requiem, but the notes wavered, strained not by emotion, but by the suffocating air pressing against their lungs. At the center of the basilica, atop the great platform draped in crimson and gold, the Pope's body awaited its final rites. And though his face, masked in wax, stared upward in serene imitation of peace, the vestments over his torso bulged as though something beneath them were shifting slowly, rhythmically, with a will all its own. But the ceremony had begun. There was no turning back. Dignitaries entered first, king's envoys, nobles, ambassadors cloaked in embroidered mourning attire. Their arrival stirred a warm tide of air that swept across the bier, causing the silk to flutter ever so slightly, as if the corpse beneath had exhaled. Then followed the clergy in long, orderly processions, their chants rising up to the stone arches and echoing back with an eerie hollowness. They carried relics, crosses, candles dribbling wax that landed on the stone floors in thick, molten drops. With each step they took, the temperature seemed to rise. Sweat beaded across foreheads. Robes clung to damp skin. Breathing grew shallow. Yet no one dared acknowledge the true source of discomfort. A few priests, stationed nearest to the bier, noticed it first, the faint quiver of the silk around the abdomen, as though bubbles of gas were gathering beneath the cloth. The chest seemed unnaturally distended. The hands, swollen inside their jeweled gloves, rested heavier on the stomach than they had the day before. One priest leaned forward slightly and froze. A soft sound emanated from within the vestments. A muffled, liquid shift. Wet, deliberate, unmistakable. He stepped back quickly, nearly stumbling into the acolyte behind him. But the ritual pressed on. The gospel reading, the incense offering, the sprinkling of holy water that hissed when it touched the warm fabric, rolling off in tiny rivulets that gleamed like sweat. As the senior cardinal approached the bier for the final blessing, the basilica held its breath. Even the choir fell silent, their last note fading into the vaulted darkness overhead. Every eye turned toward the platform. Every soul in the chamber seemed to pause. Every heartbeat merged into one slow, dreadful rhythm. The cardinal raised his hand, tremor barely hidden beneath his robes. And in the strained quiet of that moment, the collective hush of thousands waiting for divine closure, something beneath the vestments groaned. A sound so soft it was almost a whisper, yet loud enough to ripple through the clergy like a cold wind. The cardinal hesitated mid-blessing, his gaze flickering downward for just a heartbeat too long. His lips stilled, his throat tightened. A bead of sweat slid down the side of his face, carving a pale line through the incense haze. He forced himself to continue, voice steady but thin, but the body beneath the silk was no longer still. Not entirely, not safely. The heat pressed, the gases shifted, the stitching strained, and with every word of blessing spoken over that unstable corpse, the basilica crept closer to the moment that would mark it forever. It happened in an instant. One heartbeat, the basilica stood frozen in reverent silence. 1,000 mourners bowed, the cardinal's trembling hand raised in blessing, the air thick with incense and dread. The next heartbeat, the world split open. A sharp crack tore through the chamber. Not the sound of wood bending under strain, but something wetter, deeper, a rupture that seemed to echo from inside the body itself. The vestments ballooned outward. A bulge surged beneath the silk, swelling grotesquely before the fabric could resist, and then the corpse burst. A violent expulsion of gases, fluids, and decay erupted upward, tearing through the vestments in a single, sickening blast. The wax mask shattered, pieces flying like brittle shards across the altar steps. A wave of foul vapor rolled over the cardinal, knocking him backward as he choked on the sudden, suffocating stench. Screams fractured the sacred silence. Monks stumbled away, robes whipping behind them as they clutched their faces, gagging. Pilgrims fled from the front rows, trampling the hems of their garments as they fought to escape the invisible cloud that spread through the basilica like poisoned breath. Some fainted where they stood, others vomited on the stone floor. A few dropped to their knees, convinced they were witnessing a sign from heaven, a punishment, a warning, a curse made flesh before their eyes. But the attendants nearest the bier saw the truth up close. The body they had worked so desperately to contain had torn itself apart under the unbearable pressure of heat, infection, and swelling decay. The abdomen had ruptured, split open from within, spraying the altar cloths and shattering every illusion of dignity they had tried to preserve. The cardinal rose shakily, staggering back as the air itself pulsed with the stench of ruptured flesh. His voice failed him, his blessing froze in his throat. His eyes glistened with horror he would never confess. Panic consumed the basilica. Clergy spilled in every direction, abandoning the rituals they had sworn to uphold. The choir fled mid-hymn, their voices cracking into terrified cries. Guards pushed through the crowds, trying to stem the tide of bodies rushing toward the exits. Above it all, the candles flickered wildly in the rising waves of heat and chaos, their flames quivering as if recoiling from the spectacle below. And there, at the center of the disaster, the ruined corpse slumped against the shattered remnants of its own grandeur, a grim, silent testament to the truth the Church had feared. Nature does not kneel, not to titles, not to rituals, not even to a pope. The explosion had come, and nothing in the basilica would ever be the same. Before we follow the aftermath, the hurried cover-up, the secret burial, and the centuries of silence that followed, take a moment to breathe, to steady your thoughts in the wake of this terrible scene. And if you want to continue walking with us deeper into these hidden corners of history, gently tap like subscribe to Echoes of Time, and let us know where in the world you're watching from. Silence did not return to the basilica. It crawled back in pieces. The echoes of screams lingered beneath the arches long after the crowds had forced their way toward the doors. The great chamber, once filled with reverent hymn and ritual, now trembled with the sharp staccato of panicked footsteps, the gasps of the fainting, the retching of those who had inhaled the poisoned air. What remained near the bier was a ring of paralysis. The nearest clergy stood rooted to the spot, eyes wide, hands shaking, unable to decide whether to run or pray. Some stared at the shattered mask, lying in fragments on the altar steps like the broken face of a fallen statue. Others stared at the silk vestments, ripped open in a jagged burst that revealed the dark, collapsed remains beneath. A young deacon dropped to his knees, whispering prayers so fast they tangled together. Another turned away, pressing his face against a marble column, swallowing back bile. An older priest simply covered his mouth and wept, quiet, shaken, unable to reconcile what he had seen with the holiness he had spent a lifetime serving. The stench thickened, rolling outward in suffocating waves. No incense could hide it now. No ritual could deny it. No whispered reassurance could soften the horror that had just unfolded. Finally, the master of ceremonies staggered forward, his face pale as linen. For years he had governed the solemn choreography of papal rites, but now his hands trembled uncontrollably as he surveyed the devastation. "Seal the doors," he whispered. Guards obeyed at once, slamming shut the great bronze gates to prevent the remaining crowds outside from witnessing what had occurred within. The doors boomed shut, echoing through the basilica like the toll of a funeral bell. Next came the orders spoken through clenched teeth, barely louder than breath. "No one speaks of this. No details leave these walls. Remove the body, now, at once." The attendants approached with visible dread. They wrapped the remains in layers of thick cloth layers, meant to protect the living more than to honor the dead. What was left of the vestments clung wetly to the skin, fused with fluids that soaked through every barrier they laid down. The abdomen, now deflated and torn, sagged in a grotesque collapse that made the attendants avert their eyes. As they lifted the body, a thin stream of dark liquid dripped onto the marble floor, tracing a small, winding path toward the steps. One attendant gagged, steadying himself against the bier. Another crossed himself repeatedly, tears shining in his eyes. The master of ceremonies watched all of it in a rigid trance, jaw clenched so tightly it trembled. "Down to the crypt," he ordered. "No procession, no vigil, no witnesses." They carried the ruined form through a side corridor, away from the crowds, away from the public eye, into the cold shadows beneath the basilica, where no sunlight reached. Guards escorted them, heads bowed, not in reverence but in dread. Behind them, servants rushed to scrub the marble steps, scraping away the stains before the doors reopened. Choir boys were shepherded into side chapels and told to pray, though their faces were still pale with terror. Priests moved through the aisles in dazed silence, trying to pretend the air did not still tremble with the aftermath of the explosion. But no matter how the clergy tried to restore order, the basilica felt changed, its sanctity cracked like the wax mask that had shattered across its stones. Up above, the candles flickered weakly. Down below, the attendants carried the Pope's remains toward a grave prepared in frantic haste. And between those two worlds, sacred ceremony above, desperate concealment below, the truth hung suspended, trembling, alive in its own way. The church could hide the body, but it would never erase the memory of what had happened here. The corridors beneath the basilica swallowed the procession whole. Down stone steps worn smooth by centuries of passing feet, through narrow passages where torchlight clung weakly to the walls, the attendants carried what remained of the Pope, wrapped, bound, and leaking through the cloth in slow, dark traces they tried not to look at. When they reached the lower crypt, the air changed. It was colder here, stiller, untouched by the chaos erupting above. A row of ancient sarcophagi lined the chamber, their carved lids depicting the serene faces of men who had met death in far gentler ways. The attendants laid the ruined body on a slab meant for future preparation, but the master of ceremonies intervened at once. "No preparation," he said. "No rites beyond the minimum. We bury him tonight." A murmur of disbelief rippled through the chamber. A pope interred in secrecy. No final procession. No public vigil. No closing ritual of triumph or sanctity. Only darkness and haste, and the cold embrace of the crypt. But the decision was final. No one argued. No one dared. While a handful of priests whispered the shortest of prayers, so brief they seemed like apologies, the attendants lowered the body into a simple stone coffin. The cloth bulged in places it should not have, but no one looked closely. No one wanted to remember more than they already had. As the lid slid into place, sealing the last traces of the Pope from the world, a heavy silence settled over the chamber. It was not reverence. It was exhaustion, fear, relief tinged with shame. Above them, the basilica stirred as the clergy worked to restore order. Below, the crypt held its newest secret. But secrets do not stay buried. Not in a city where servants whispered after dark. Not among clergy whose faces had gone pale with shock. Not among pilgrims who had seen the panic, who had caught the scent, who had sensed that something had gone terribly, impossibly wrong. Rumors slipped through the cracks of silence like water through stone. They spread from monk to merchant, from merchant to traveler, from traveler to distant city. Each telling bent the truth a little, stretched it, darkened it, embroidered it with awe and dread, until the story no longer needed witnesses to survive. It had become a legend, breathing, shifting, alive in the mouths of those who carried it. The Pope who rotted alive. The Pope whose body rebelled against rituals. The Pope who exploded at his own funeral. A tale whispered in taverns, confessed in monasteries, murmured by candlelight long after the church tried to bury it with him. Before we rise from these crypts and follow the path this story carved across generations, take a moment to support the work of uncovering the past's buried truths. If this journey holds you, if these forgotten histories speak to you, gently tap like, subscribe to Echoes of Time, and tell us where in the world you're watching from. In the centuries that followed, the basilica was cleaned, the marble restored, the vestments burned, and the clergy who had witnessed the disaster carried their silence to the grave. Official records spoke of a dignified funeral, a peaceful passing, a ceremony unmarred by anything but grief. But the truth lingered. It clung not to parchment or decree, but to memory, the kind that lives in the cracks of history where light rarely reaches. The church made quiet changes in the years after that terrible day. Rituals shifted, timelines shortened, embalming practices grew more cautious, more meticulous, as if every cardinal and bishop involved had sworn silently that no such catastrophe would ever unfold again. Bodies were no longer left to lie in state for days in warm seasons. Precautions were taken to avoid heat, crowds, and candles gathering too close. New methods were developed, cooler chambers, tighter sealing, faster burial rites that disguised themselves as reverent efficiency. But the shadow of what had happened beneath the vaulted arches never fully faded. For even as official histories painted serene portraits of papal endings, whispers continued to thread their way through monasteries and libraries, cloisters and kitchens. Scholars found hints in private letters. Travelers repeated echoes of older tales. Priests muttered vague warnings about the dangers of summer funerals. It became one of those truths that survives not because it is written, but because it refuses to die. A caution, a reminder, a quiet admission that not even the highest seat in Christendom can escape the laws of flesh and rot. Over time, the story took on a strange gravity. Some treated it as a parable about pride, others as a lesson in humility. A few saw it as proof of the terrible intimacy between power and mortality, how even a man wrapped in gold and authority could be undone by something as simple, as universal, as the heat of a Roman summer. And though the basilica still stands, its marble polished and its chapels glowing with reverence, somewhere beneath it lies a coffin placed in haste, a burial carried out in fear, and the memory of a moment the Church hoped the world would forget. But stories are stubborn. They persist. They leak through the cracks. They rise like smoke from old stone. And this one, the tale of a pope who rotted faster than ceremony could contain, who burst beneath the weight of ritual and heat, has become a permanent scar in the hidden history of the papacy. A warning written not in ink, but in memory. The story returns, finally, to the present, to us, to the quiet space between history and myth where echoes linger long after the world has moved on. In that silence, we are left to ask ourselves why this tale survived when so many others were quietly erased. Why this moment, this horror, this rupture in the marble calm of a basilica refused to die alongside the man at its center. Perhaps it endures because it strips away the illusion that power can shield a person from the simplest truths of the human body. Perhaps it survives because it lays bare the fragile boundary between reverence and reality. Or perhaps it remains because those who witnessed it could not bear the weight of silence, and so they let their whispers slip into the world where time could carry them farther than any decree. And here we stand centuries later, listening to the echoes of that day, piecing together the fragments of fear and ritual, disaster and secrecy, truth and the desperate attempt to bury it. History is not always carved in stone. Sometimes it is carried in breath, in rumor, in memory that refuses to fade. Sometimes the past calls to us not with triumph, but with warning. It asks us to look closer, to question what we are told, to remember that beneath crowns and titles and tapestries of ceremony, the body remains only human, and nature bows to no throne. And if you wish to continue exploring these forgotten chambers of the past, these stories that time tried and failed to silence, then walk with us a little farther. Lend your curiosity. Lend your presence. Lend your voice to the work of uncovering what lies beneath the polished surface of history. Take a moment to like this video, subscribe to Echoes of Time, and tell us where in the world you're watching from. Your support keeps these buried stories alive.